wetlands.
One looks expensive, the other doesn't.
7 dead birds.
He's dressed as a hunter with hunting gear, like I said, the waders, the jacket. He's got his belt with shotgun shells, and the other guy appears to be wearing basically something he can do to do any kind of task.
And you're looking at someone who is hunting to survive versus someone who is hunting for sport.
So I'm kind of curious, how many of you have spent more than an hour outside at one time in the past week? So I think it's really important that we think about how much time we spend outside and in nature. And hunting is one of those really primordial ways that we have always interacted with the outside, with the outdoors, and interacted with biodiversity. So for me, I look at this painting and I immediately think about hunters. They are a huge conservation group. They're a very meaningful conservation group. And they're one that traditionally you can see a little bit of friction between the conservation biologists and the hunters. And we shouldn't see that friction. We actually have exactly the same goals. And you've seen in conservation where we actually started this field because of waterfowl in many reasons. Some of the very original attempts to save land was trying to save wetlands to make sure that we had places for ducks to breed. I also look at this painting and I look at the guy on the left and I think Teddy Roosevelt. I just see that instantly when I look at it. And that for me is a very positive association as well, because we wouldn't have our National Park Service system without Teddy Roosevelt. Again, it's that idea that we have to be stewards of our land because we gain something from the land. This is a resource. We're getting to a point now where we may not be interacting with the land as much. So is it really critical to preserve these huge forests? Is it really critical to have this National Park Service? Why can't we just develop it? You know, you start to see these questions because we may not have actually visited our park that often. We do have several different types of public lands in the US. And one of the reasons why we have several types of public lands in the US is because of the different groups of people who access public lands. Some of the things that come to mind for me are national forests, very much somewhere where you would see a hunting resource use type of management to them. We extract logs from them. We also have, as I mentioned at the other extreme, our national parks. And again, I think of Teddy Roosevelt and Yellowstone every time I say that, because these are areas where we decided that land was so important, that space was so important, that we didn't want to extract anything from them. In the middle, we have things like wildlife refuges, and those are under the control more of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that is very much something that started for waterfowl preservation. And again, just to make sure that we were keeping spaces that preserved a resource that we use. Now, sometimes hunters have a really positive impact on conservation. When it comes to setting aside land and protecting it, that's an awesome way to go. It's not always beneficial, though. Another thing I think about when I look at this painting is what happened about 30 years later to a different type of bird. So I sit here and look at the waterfowl and how much hunting we do. There was the passenger pigeon that thrived all across the United States. Flocks of passenger pigeons that were so huge that they would actually darken the sky for several minutes as they flew overhead. Estimated to be in the billions population size. And we actually managed to drive them to extinction. The last one died in 1914 in a zoo in Cincinnati. The last wild flocks were gone in 1906. And this painting was done in about 1878, I think. So this was done in a time period when we thought, hey, we can do nothing wrong. There's so many resources here in the United States that we can really take advantage of them. And you see these changes in our gear, the changes in our technology allowed us to really be exploitive in a way we never had been before. The muzzle loader that you had to actually pack with powder yourself meant that you could only fire off a shot every 30 seconds to a minute. And it's pretty hard to kill a lot of birds when you're doing that because you fire one shot and a lot of them fly away. If you're out there with a more rapid fire gun, you can do a little bit more damage. And the faster our machines got, the more damage we were capable of doing. And the same thing is going on right now in our oceans, actually. That's one of the huge reasons why we're overfishing so many species, is we've gone from a hook and line type fishery where you have to cast, get something to eat the bait on your hook and pull it in, to where we have huge nets that we can trawl through the ocean, to even more precise detection where we have sonars and ways that we can actually track large fish in the ocean and go make sure we scoop them up out of it. So the more advanced our technology gets, the better we are at resource extraction, and the more harmful that ends up being to biodiversity.
I watched a program about the Dust Bowl,
And essentially the point was the same, that when the original farmers came out there, they found this grassland that was so rich, so verdant, and they began to plant wheat by using horses and plows. But then they got tractors, and exactly the same phenomenon. They overdid it so that once the rain did not come, all of the topsoil was gone because it had all been turned over. They never could have done that had they used more primitive methods. So it's almost as though with the technology comes the potential for destruction.
If you look at the ducks that he's carrying, the ducks go from his shoulder to his waist, which is extremely large for most of the ducks that I've seen, and I've done some duck hunting before. And I think that's also a statement as to the period that there was more food in nature for the ducks to eat. They grew larger and fatter, whereas today, because of the stresses on their environment and their food source, they're not nearly as large.
When humans tend to colonize a new environment, the largest animals tend to go first. And we've seen this all around the world. 18,000 years ago, when we first arrived in North America, you lost some very large megafauna like mastodons and things like that. When we arrived in New Zealand 800 years ago, the giant moa, the huge birds, they were the ones that went extinct. But more recently, we see that we also affect the body size of the animals as well. So in the oceans, our giant fish, the largest fish we have in the oceans, are now 20 to 50% smaller than they were just 50 years ago. Because we harvest the biggest ones because they provide the most meat. But that means suddenly, we're getting rid of all the big ones and we're removing others of them before they have time to become big. And there's actually a selective pressure on these animals to not grow in size. We see some animals actually mature earlier than they used to because they're trying to reproduce before they get too big and get eaten by humans. So yes, that's a very important point, is the change in body size with human use of the environment. What also happened was habitat destruction. We kept changing the landscape. We kept converting forests into agricultural fields. And these days, roughly 30% of the US landscape is, 30% is agricultural, 30% is forested, and then 10% or so is urbanized. And I'm missing a huge chunk of land use here as I say this. What's the other third that I'm missing? 10% is urbanized. I'm going to guess the other 15% is actually suburban, rural type settings that we have. But yeah, the change from forests into agricultural fields has had a major impact on our biodiversity. And that's what's impacting our streams the most as well, to tie it actually to our rivers for a little while. Every time we remove a forest from a stream, we dramatically change the dynamics of that stream. We've removed this protective layer around the stream.
So how do you help a place like South America that's trying to develop and becoming developing countries slash and burn, deforesting, like maybe we did hundreds of years ago, but yet they want to develop. So you can't just say, hey, don't do this.
Don't do what we did. Sorry, stay where you are.
Stay at this level, we want to keep you down, quote unquote.
That's a really good question. And actually, that's part of why I work in North American biodiversity. I'm a huge proponent of let's clean up our own mess first before we tell other people what to do with their problems. So it's very important to me to actually work here at home and try to increase our forest cover here and do things that we can actually make a difference in our own community. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be helping others when they ask for our help, but it's much easier for me to go outside and pick up trash from my riverbank than it is for me to tell someone in Brazil that they ought to be picking up their trash. And I can see the difference that I make here. So I'm a huge proponent of people getting involved here at home. For me, the biggest thing right now is actually contacting legislators and telling them what you think about these issues. I think there's nothing more important than sharing your information and your thoughts with your representatives, whatever they are. They need to hear from you. Other things that I like to see people do are getting involved with groups like the Tennessee River Rescue. Of course, you can volunteer with the aquarium as well. And I'm not going to tell you not to. I just like to plug some of the others as well. Groups like the South Chickamauga Creek Conservancy are planting trees along their stream banks, and that's something that's happening here in Chattanooga that you could be a part of. Simple things like trash still really matter. Making sure your trash goes where it's supposed to and doesn't float all the way downstream, impacting every downstream community and then the world's ocean. Trash, marine pollution is a major, major problem right now. we have a gigantic swirl of plastic in the ocean, and that's because of all of us. That also relates to bringing your own cloth shopping bag to the grocery store. As trite as it sounds, the more we stop using those plastic bags, the fewer of them are going to end up in the ocean as well. So these simple changes really do matter. That's one thing that frustrates me, is when people say, well, I'm not going to do that because no one else is. That's exactly the wrong attitude to take. Do it because no one else is, and then tell them that you're doing it.